In the autumn of 1894, in the first week of November, a woman of 53 named Hester Marlowe came down from London by train to take possession of the house she had inherited from her grandfather, and to learn from his old housekeeper the duty that came with it. The house was called Coldwell. It stood at the foot of a long valley in the Yorkshire Dales, in a village of perhaps 30 cottages and a small grey church, and had belonged to the Marlowe family for 192 years. Hester's grandfather, Joseph Marlowe, had been the 7th man of his line to hold the house. He had lived in it alone for the last 40 years of his life, after the death of his only son, Hester's father, in a riding accident in 1854, when Hester had been 13. Joseph had taken in his granddaughter for the 8 years after her father's death, raised her in the house, and then sent her to London at 21 to make whatever life she could. He had not, in the 32 years since, expected her to come back. She had not expected to come back either. She had married a kind man in London who worked at the Admiralty, had borne him 2 children, had buried him in 1888 of a heart that had failed earlier than anyone had thought it would, and had raised her son and daughter to adulthood in the small house in Bloomsbury her husband had left her. Her son was in India with the army now. Her daughter was married in Edinburgh and was expecting her first child. Hester had been, when the lawyer's letter had come in September, considering what she would do with the rest of her life, which she had begun to suspect was going to be longer and emptier than she had reckoned with. The lawyer's letter had said that her grandfather had died at the age of 91, and that the house and its small estate had been left to her, and that there were matters her grandfather had instructed the lawyer to put before her in person and not by post. The matters were the reason for the visit. The lawyer was an old man in Settle named Mr. Halfyard, who had been her grandfather's solicitor for 50 years, and who had, when Hester had presented herself at his office that morning, given her a careful explanation of the estate, and then said, at the end of it, that there was one further thing. He had said it was a thing he had been instructed to read to her in his office, in his own presence, before she went up to the house. He had said it was a condition of the inheritance. He had said it was binding for as long as she held the house, and that she could refuse it, and that if she refused it the house would go to a second cousin in Halifax whom she did not know. He had asked her if she wished to hear it before he read it. She had said she did. He had read, "On every night of every year that the inheritor holds the house, the inheritor shall, between the hour of 9 and the hour of 10 in the evening, climb the front stair of Coldwell to the upper landing, take down from its peg the key that hangs on the inner wall above the landing window, and with this key wind the long case clock that stands at the head of the landing. The winding is to be done in the proper way. The key is to be turned 8 full turns of the winding shaft, and no more, and the weights are to be raised to the position marked on the inside of the case by a small brass pin. The winding is to be done every night without exception. The clock is not, by any act of the inheritor or by any neglect, to be permitted to stop. If the clock should stop, the inheritor is not to wind it back up. The inheritor is to send at once for the housekeeper, who will instruct the inheritor in what is to be done. The inheritor is not to speak of the clock or of the duty of its winding to any person outside the household, and is to pass the duty, in due course, to the next inheritor on the same terms." He had set the paper down. He had said, before she had spoken, that her grandfather had wound the clock every night of his 91 years that he had been in the house, and that he had never, by any record kept by him, or by the housekeeper, or by the housekeeper before her, let it stop. He had said the duty had been kept by every Marlowe who had held the house since 1702, when the house had been built. He had said he could tell her nothing more about it than what was written on the paper, because her grandfather had told him nothing more, and because her grandfather had said, when Mr. Halfyard had asked him 40 years ago what the clock was for, that the not knowing was the only protection the inheritor had, and he would not strip his granddaughter of it. He had said he was sorry he could not be more useful. He had said her grandfather had instructed him to tell her, also, that the housekeeper at Coldwell, a woman named Mrs. Aiken, who had served the house for 41 years, would tell her what the housekeeper was permitted to tell, and that Mrs. Aiken's word on the matter could be trusted in every particular. He had asked Hester whether she wished to sign. Hester had thought about her empty house in Bloomsbury. She had thought about the rest of her life. She had thought about her grandfather, who had raised her from 13 to 21, and had been, in those 8 years, the only adult in her life who had been entirely present, and who had, by his choice of her over any other Marlowe relation for this inheritance, told her something he had not been able to tell her by letter in the 32 years since. She had signed, Mr. Hafyard had stood, he had walked her to the door. At the door he had stopped, the way old solicitors do at doors when they have one more thing to say. Mrs. Marlowe. Yes, Mr. Hafyard. I have known your grandfather 50 years. I have known him as a man who did not, in all that time, take a single night away from this house. He was offered, twice, the chance to go down to London to visit you when your children were small. He refused both times. He gave reasons that were not, at the time, the true reason. The true reason was the clerk. I tell you this because you will be tempted, in the years to come, to think the duty is a small one, a matter of climbing a stair and turning a key. It is not a small duty. It has cost the Marlowes of Coldwell every night of every year for nearly 200 years, and it has cost them, in particular, the freedom to be elsewhere when their families have needed them. Your grandfather did not see your father buried because your father was buried in Lincolnshire, and he could not leave the house. He did not see his great-grandchildren who are in Edinburgh now. He did not, after the first year of your widowhood, come down to see whether you were managing. I tell you these things because they are true, and because you have, in the last hour, taken on the same constraint, and I think you should know what it costs before you have spent the first night under it. Hester had not spoken for some seconds. Thank you, Mr. Hafyard. I am sorry to tell you these things, Mrs. Marlowe. I would not, if I had not promised your grandfather I would. My grandfather instructed you to tell me this. He instructed me to tell you exactly that in those words. The list of what he did not do. He said you should know. Hester had taken the trap up the dale from Settle in the late afternoon. The driver had set her down at the gate of the house, would not come further, and had said the cart would bring her trunk up the next morning. She had walked up the short path with her small case in her hand. The house came into view as she rounded the gate post, a square stone house of 3 stories, dark grey stone, slate roof, 4 windows on each floor in front, with a single window set into the gable above the front door that had a fanlight of leaded glass. There was smoke from 2 of the chimneys. Mrs. Aiken had been up that morning and had lit the fires, and had gone back to her cottage in the village to give Hester her arrival in private. Hester pushed the front door open. The entrance hall was square, flagged, with a stone fireplace at the rear, and the front stair rising up the wall to the right. The walls had been whitewashed in the last year and were clean and bright. There was a small table by the door with a brass tray on it for cards. There was a long case clock in the corner of the hall behind the door. She did not, for a moment, see the clerk at the head of the stair. She saw only the hall clerk, which was a perfectly ordinary clerk of the sort that stands in halls of houses of that period, a tall walnut case, a round white face with Roman numerals, a slow, heavy pendulum visible through the glass of the lower case. It was running. She watched it for a moment. The pendulum swung. The hands were at the correct time by her own watch. She set her case down. She went up the stair to the upper landing. The upper landing was a small square space at the top of the stair, lit by a single tall window onto the kitchen garden behind the house. 3 doors opened from the landing, 1 to the left, 2 to the right. The walls were whitewashed. Above the window, on the inner wall, hung a single iron key on a leather thong. The key was perhaps the length of her hand, with a hollow shaft and a complicated bit. At the head of the landing, against the wall opposite the stair, stood the clerk. It was older than the hall clerk. It was much older. The case was of dark oak, almost black with age, taller than she was by perhaps 2 feet, narrower than the hall clerk and more upright, with a long body and a small hooded top. The face was not white, but the colour of old vellum, with hands of forged iron and numerals that had been painted on by hand. The dial had no maker's name on it. There was no minute hand. There was an hour hand only. The pendulum behind the glass of the lower case was a heavy brass disc on a long iron rod, and it was swinging, slow and steady, with a small dry tick that was the only sound in the upper landing of the house. She stood in front of the clerk. He looked at it for some time. It was, she thought, perhaps the oldest piece of furniture she had ever stood in front of. The case had the kind of dark patina that wood acquires only over many lifetimes of being touched in the same places. There were 2 worn places on the case door, at the height of a hand turning a key, where the wood had been polished smooth by the hands of generations of Marlowes, opening the door to wind the works. There was a small brass pin on the inside of the case, just visible through the glass, set into the wood beside the chain that held the weights. The weights themselves were 2 heavy iron blocks suspended on chains, and they were perhaps a third of the way up the case at the moment, which suggested that her grandfather had wound the clock perhaps 2/3 of the way through its 8-turn cycle the last night he had been able to climb the stair. She thought about her grandfather. She thought about him climbing this stair every night for the 40 years between her father's death and his own, including the night her father had died in Lincolnshire, and he had not gone to bury him. She heard the front door open behind her downstairs. Mrs. Marlowe. A woman's voice, older. She came down. Mrs. Aiken was at the foot of the stair. She was a small woman, perhaps 70, with grey hair under a black cap and a black dress, and the deliberate stillness of a woman who had spent 41 years in a house where deliberate stillness was the form patience took. She did not curtsy. She had not, when Hester had been a child here, curtsied either. She had always treated Hester as a granddaughter of the house rather than as a lady to be deferred to, and Hester saw now that this had been a choice, and a kind one. "You are taller than the last time I saw you, Mrs. Marlowe, 32 years taller." "Hello, Mrs. Aiken." The older woman came forward. She took Hester's hands in her own dry, warm hands, and she held them for a moment, and she looked at her face, and she said, "He talked about you every day. I want you to know that. He talked about you and your husband and your children every day of these last 32 years, and there was not one day in any of them that he did not wish he could go down to London and see you. I want you to know that before we speak of anything else. Mr. Halfyard told me. Mr. Halfyard told you the cost. I am telling you the love. They are the same thing told 2 different ways." Hester did not just then trust her voice. Mrs. Aiken released her hands. She stepped back. She said, "I will make tea. Come down to the kitchen. We will speak of the clerk when you have something warm in you. The clerk is not a thing to speak of cold." The kitchen at Coldwell was a long flagged room at the back of the house, with a deep window onto the kitchen garden, and a great range that Mrs. Aiken had been keeping going since before dawn. Hester sat at the long scrubbed table that had been there in her childhood, and Mrs. Aiken made tea, and they drank it, and Mrs. Aiken talked for some time about ordinary things. The household, the grazing tenant in the upper valley, the repairs to the slate that the autumn rain had revealed. Hester understood that Mrs. Aiken was giving her a quarter of an hour of ordinary things before the conversation that mattered, and Hester was grateful for it, because the conversation that mattered was, she could feel coming, going to be longer than she could have sat down to without warning. When Mrs. Aiken had drunk her own tea, she set the cup down. "Now I will tell you, Mrs. Marlowe, what I am permitted to tell. I will tell you also what I am not permitted to tell, because there is a difference, and you should know where the line is. Your grandfather and I agreed on the line many years ago. I have not crossed it in 40 years. I will not cross it tonight. Yes, Mrs. Aiken. The clerk at the head of the upper stair has been wounded by a Marlowe of Coldwell every night since the house was built in 1702. It was wound before this house was built in another house that stood on the same ground, which is the house your several times great-grandfather pulled down in 1701 to build the present one. The duty is older than the house. How much older I do not know. Your grandfather did not know. He had asked his own grandfather, who had told him the duty was older than any Marlowe could remember being told the beginning of, and that he should ask no more about it, because the asking did not yield any answer that the family had found useful in the 4 generations since they had stopped asking. What does the clerk do? The clerk keeps time, Mrs. Marlowe. I will say it that way, because that is the only way I am permitted to say it. The clerk keeps time. The winding of it is the keeping. The keeping has been done for as long as anyone remembers, and it has been done by your family, because the house and the ground the house stands on are your family's, and the keeping is part of what your family owes the ground. What does it keep time of? I am not permitted to say. Mrs. Aiken. I am not permitted to say, Mrs. Marlowe, and the not saying has nothing to do with you, and everything to do with what I promised your grandfather. He did not tell me what the clerk keeps time of. He told me only that the duty was to keep it wound. He kept it wound. I helped him keep it wound. I did not ask him beyond what he told me, and he did not tell me beyond what was useful. The not knowing has been my own discipline for 40 years, and I have kept it. I will tell you only what I have been told to tell. Hester thought about this. What happens if the clerk stops? Mrs. Aiken looked at her. The look was a long one. That, Mrs. Marlowe, is the one thing I have been told that I can pass on to you. The clerk is not, on any night, to be permitted to stop. If the clerk stops, the inheritor of the house is to send for me at once. I am to come up. I am to be in the room with the inheritor and the clerk until the clerk is started again, which will require to be done by a person other than the inheritor. There is, in the house at the back of the upper stair, a small locked cupboard. The key to that cupboard is on the ring with the kitchen keys. Inside the cupboard is a written instruction in your grandfather's hand, sealed with his seal, which is to be opened only if the clerk stops. The instruction will tell whoever opens it what is to be done. Neither I nor your grandfather has ever read the instruction. He wrote it 40 years ago, the year after your father died, on the only night the clerk stopped in his tenure. Hester sat very still. The clerk stopped, Mrs. Aiken. Once, in your grandfather's tenure, in the spring of 1855, 6 months after your father's death. Your grandfather had not slept properly in those 6 months. He had been carrying you, who were 13, and the running of the house, and the running of the estate, and his own grief at having buried his only son. And one night in May, he came up to wind the clerk, and he sat down on the chair at the head of the landing for a moment to rest before he turned the key, and he fell asleep in the chair, and when he woke the clerk had stopped. What did he do? He sent for the housekeeper before me, who was my own mother. She came up. She was in the room with him for the hour it took him to do whatever was to be done. I was 11 years old at the time. My mother did not, in her life, tell me what was done in that hour. She told me only that the clerk had stopped, and that your grandfather had started it again, and that he had then sat down on the chair at the head of the landing, and had not been able to stand for some hours, and that she had sat with him until he was able to stand. He had written the instruction for the cupboard within a week of the stopping, and he had told her then, and me afterwards when I succeeded her, that the instruction was to be opened only if the clerk stopped again. The clerk did not stop again in his tenure. It has not stopped in mine. I have not, since 1855, been called to the upper landing in the middle of the night. What was the cost? To my grandfather. Mrs. Aiken did not, for some seconds, answer. He did not, after 1855, sleep more than 4 hours in any night of his life, Mrs. Marlowe. He did not, after 1855, eat a meal without watching the clock in the dining room. He did not, in the 39 years between the stopping and his death, take any of the offers he had to leave this house even for a day. He told me, once, late in his life, that whatever he had seen in the hour the clock had been stopped had not gone away from him in all the years that followed. He said it had become quieter. He said he had grown used to it. He said he would not, however, recommend to anyone the seeing of it. That is the cost of letting the clock stop, Mrs. Marlowe. As I have observed it, there may be other costs I do not know. Hester sat with this. Mrs. Aiken. Yes, you said the inheritor is not to wind the clock back up if it stops. You said the starting of it is to be done by someone other than the inheritor. That is what your grandfather instructed me to tell. Why? I do not know, Mrs. Marlowe. I have a thought which I will share with you because the thought is mine and not your grandfather's, and the sharing of it is not against my promise to him. I think the clock, if it stops, becomes a different thing. I think the winding of it by the keeper every night is the keeping of it as the thing it has been. I think a clock that has stopped is no longer that thing, and the starting of it by the keeper would be the keeper's hand on a different thing, and the keeper is not, in the family's judgment over many generations, to put his or her hand on the different thing. The starting is done by the housekeeper because the housekeeper is not the keeper of the house, and the difference matters. I am telling you this as a thought. I am not telling you it is the truth. Thank you, Mrs. Aiken. There is one more thing, Mrs. Marlowe. Yes, the hour of the winding is between 9 and 10 in the evening. The earlier in the hour you wind it, the more grace you have if something prevents you the next night. Your grandfather wounded at 9, or as near 9 as he could. I would advise you to do the same. The grace of the hour is the thing that protects a keeper who is ill or who has been delayed. Do not waste it by winding late. I will not. Then we will go up, and I will show you the winding tonight, and you will wind it yourself, and from tomorrow it will be your hand on the key. They went up at 5 minutes to 9. Mrs. Aiken took the key down from its peg on the inner wall above the window. She handed it to Hester. Open the door of the case. Hester opened the door. The inside of the case smelled of old wood and old metal and something faintly oily that she took to be the lubricant in the works. The 2 iron weights hung on their chains. The small brass pin was set into the wood beside the chain on the left. Fit the key to the winding shaft on the left side. Hester fitted it, the key seated with a small dry click. 8 full turns. Slowly. Count them aloud. Hester turned the key. 1. The works inside the case made a small ratcheting sound. The weight on the left climbed an inch. 2. The same sound. The weight climbed another inch. She counted to 8. The weight by the 8th turn was a hand's breadth below the small brass pin Mrs. Aiken had spoken of. Hester drew the key out. She looked at the pin and the weight. That is the position. That is the position. Close the door. Hang the key. Stand back from the clock and look at it for a moment. Hester closed the door of the case. She hung the key on the peg. She stepped back. The clock ticked. The hour hand was a few minutes from 9. The pendulum behind the glass swung slow and steady. Mrs. Aiken stood beside her and did not speak. After a moment, Mrs. Aiken said, "That is the duty. It will take you, in the years to come, less than 3 minutes from the foot of the stair to the standing where you are now. The doing of it is small. The keeping of it is what is large." "I understand. Good night, Mrs. Marlowe. I will be here at 7. "Good night, Mrs. Aiken." The older woman went down. Hester heard her in the kitchen, banking the range, closing the back door. She heard her cross the kitchen garden and go through the gate. She heard the small dry tick of the clock at the head of the stair. She did not, that night, go to bed at once. She sat in the small sitting room downstairs by the fire her grandfather had sat by for 40 years, and she thought about him, and she thought about her father, who had died in Lincolnshire and had not been buried by his own father because the clock had to be wound that night. She thought about her own son in India and her own daughter in Edinburgh, and about the grandchild who was on the way, and about whether she would, if a daughter sent for her in childbirth, be able to go down to Edinburgh for the lying-in. She thought she would not. She thought she had taken on, in the morning at Mr. Halfyard's office, the same constraint her grandfather had lived under for 40 years, and that the constraint would be the shape of the rest of her life. She went up at 11:30. She slept in the bedroom that had been hers as a girl. She did not, in the night, hear anything from the clock at the head of the stair. She wound the clock for 47 nights without incident. The 48th night was the 23rd of December. She had been ill 3 days with a chest cold she had caught from the boy who came up from the village with the post, and she had been keeping her bed since the 21st. She had wound the clock both of the previous nights by getting up and going to the stair head and turning the key and going back to bed afterward, and the going had taken everything she had each night. Mrs. Aiken had stayed late both evenings to help her up the stair and back down. Mrs. Aiken had wanted to stay the night both nights, and Hester had refused her, because Mrs. Aiken was 70 and the cottage was a half-mile down the road, and the night was cold. On the 23rd, Hester was worse than she had been on the 22nd. The fever had come up in the afternoon. Mrs. Aiken had wanted to send for the doctor, and Hester had said no. The doctor had been the day before, and there was no more he could do tonight. Mrs. Aiken had brought her a bath at 6 and had stayed until 8. She had asked Hester whether she was certain she could wind the clock. Hester had said she was. Mrs. Aiken had gone home at 8 on the strength of Hester's word. At 9, Hester got out of bed. The bedroom was on the upper floor, 3 doors from the landing. She did not, in honesty, remember the walk to the landing afterward. She remembered the door of her own room opening, and she remembered the cold of the floorboards through her stockings, and she remembered the small light of her candle, and she remembered being at the foot of the case of the clock with the key in her hand. She remembered sitting down on the small chair at the head of the landing. She remembered thinking that she would rest for a moment, only a moment. The hour was 9. She had until 10. There was time. She fell asleep. She woke because the clock had stopped. She did not, at first, understand what had woken her. The candle on the small table by the chair had burned down by perhaps an inch. The hour, by the position of the candle, was perhaps 9:15, perhaps 9:30. The house was very quiet. It was so quiet that she did not, in the first seconds of waking, understand what was wrong with the quietness. Then she did. The clock was not ticking. She looked at the clock. The hour hand was at 5 minutes past 9. The pendulum behind the glass was still. It hung dead at the center of its swing, and it did not move. Hester sat in the chair on the landing in her nightdress, with a candle burning beside her, and a clock that had stopped at 5 minutes past 9 in front of her, and she understood, then, what her grandfather had understood on a night in May 1855, when he had been 38 years old, and the only son he had ever had been 6 months in the ground. She did not, at first, move. She thought, with the slow, careful thinking of a sick woman in the small hours, about what she had been told. If the clock stops, send for the housekeeper at once. The housekeeper was a half-mile away in the village. The night was a December night, and the road was a road of frozen mud, and Hester was barefoot in her nightdress with a fever, and there was no boy in the house to send. She would have to go herself. She would have to dress and go down the stair and out the door and along the road and knock at the cottage and bring Mrs. Aiken back, and the doing of it would take her an hour at the least. She had been told not to wind the clock. She had been told the starting was to be done by someone other than the keeper. She had been told this twice, once by Mr. Halfyard in the office in Settle, and once by Mrs. Aiken in the kitchen on her first evening, with the iron key in her hand. But she had also been told that her grandfather had wound the clock himself, on the night in May 1855, before Mrs. Aiken's mother had reached the house. Mrs. Aiken had said her mother had been in the room with him for the hour it had taken him to do whatever was to be done. She had not said her mother had wound the clock. She had said only that her mother had been in the room. The wording, Hester thought now, sitting in the chair, was the kind of wording a housekeeper uses when she is keeping a promise about what she will not tell. The wording was not the same thing as the rule. Hester thought about going down to Mrs. Aiken. She thought about what going down would cost her at her current state of fever and at the temperature of the night. She thought she would, perhaps, manage it. She thought she would also, perhaps, not. She thought about the cupboard at the back of the landing, with the sealed instruction in her grandfather's hand. The cupboard was 4 paces from where she sat. The key to it was on the kitchen ring downstairs. She could go down. She could come back up. She could open the cupboard. She could read the instruction. The reading of the instruction would tell her what to do, which she did not in this moment know. She decided after some seconds to read the instruction. She did not, then or after, think the decision was the wrong one. She was a sick woman alone in a house with a clerk that had stopped, with no boy to send and no strength to go herself, and her grandfather had left an instruction in a cupboard precisely for this kind of situation, and the cupboard was 4 paces from her chair. The instruction was the resource her grandfather had provided to a person in the position she was in. He had foreseen the position. He had written the instruction. She would read it. She stood up. Her legs took her weight. The fever had thickened her head but had not yet taken her balance. She went down the stair slowly, holding the rail. She went into the kitchen. She found the ring of keys hanging on the inside of the larder door. She took it. She went back up the stair. The cupboard at the back of the landing was a small, low cupboard set into the wall between the 2 right-hand doors. She had not, in the 7 weeks she had been in the house, opened it. She had not even, in honesty, noticed it. The door of it was painted the same white as the wall, and the keyhole was small and dark and easy to miss. She found it now. She knelt in front of it. She tried the keys on the ring one by one. The 3rd key turned. Inside the cupboard was a small wooden box. The box was not locked. She lifted the lid. There was 1 sheet of paper inside. It was folded once. It had been sealed in red wax with her grandfather's seal, a stag's head with the antlers raised, and the seal had been broken once and resealed, perhaps when he had read it back to check his own writing. The paper was the colour paper goes after 40 years in a closed cupboard in an unheated landing. It had her name on the outside in her grandfather's hand, Hester, or to whichever Marlowe finds it. She broke the seal. She unfolded the paper. She read, "If you are reading this, the clerk has stopped, and you are alone, or the housekeeper has not yet come, or has come and cannot help. I am sorry that you are reading it. I am sorry. More, that I cannot tell you what I learned the night I wrote it. I have spent 40 years deciding what to put in this paper, and the deciding has been the work of my life since I let the clerk stop. And what I have decided is this. I will tell you what to do. I will not tell you what you will see. The doing is 1 paper. The seeing is another paper, which I have not written and will not write, because what I learned was that the seeing is the cost, and that no inheritor should be made to bear the seeing without the choosing. Here is what to do. Go into the room with the clerk. Sit in the chair at the head of the landing. Do not stand. Do not approach the clerk. Do not, with your hand or your foot or any other part of you, touch the clerk or the wall the clerk stands against. Sit in the chair. The pendulum, in a clerk that has stopped, is at the center of its swing. It will, in the next hour, begin to move on its own. It will move a hand's breadth first to one side, then to the other, then back. The movement will be slow. The movement is the clerk starting itself again, which is the thing that happens in the absence of a Marlowe's hand. You are not to assist it. You are to sit in the chair and you are to witness it. The witnessing is the form the rule takes when the rule has been broken. You will, while you witness, see what is in the room with you. The seeing is the cost. I cannot describe it to you. It is not the same thing for every keeper who has seen it. It was, for me, the shape of a thing I had been pretending was not in the house since the day my own father had died. For you, it will be a different shape. The shape will be the shape your own life has prepared you to see. You will sit in the chair and you will see it, and you will not, while you are seeing it, stand. When the clock has begun to tick again, on its own, you will stand. You will leave the landing. You will close the door at the foot of the stair behind you. You will not go back up until first light. In the morning the clock will be running, and the duty will continue. You will not, in the rest of your life, let it stop again. I am sorry, Hester. I have been sorry for 40 years. Your father did not die because I let the clock stop. He died because he was thrown from a horse. The clerk stopped because I was tired and grieving, and I sat down for a moment in the chair. The clerk did not punish me by taking my son. The clerk punished me, if it punished me at all, by showing me what was in the room. You will not, after tonight, mistake the one for the other. I have spent 40 years not mistaking it. It is a thing you can be taught not to mistake. I am teaching you now. Sit in the chair. Witness. Stand when it ticks. Go down. Sleep if you can. Your grandfather, Joseph Marlowe, who has loved you since you were 13. Hester sat on the floor of the landing in her nightdress, and she read the letter 3 times. The 3rd time she folded it. She put it back in the wooden box. She closed the cupboard. She locked it. She put the key ring on the floor beside her. She stood up. She went to the small chair at the head of the landing. She sat down in it. She put her hands flat on her knees. She waited. The pendulum, after some minutes she did not measure, began to move. It moved a hand's breadth to the left. It moved a hand's breadth to the right. It moved back. The movement was, as her grandfather had written, slow. While the pendulum moved, the room around her changed. She did not, ever in her life afterward, describe what she saw. She did not tell Mrs. Aiken in the morning. She did not tell her son when he came home from India 3 years later. She did not tell her daughter when she went to Edinburgh at last for the christening of her grandchild, 8 months after the night in December. She did not, in the 26 years that followed, tell anyone. She wrote her own paper at the age of 60, when she had been 10 years past the stopping, and she sealed it with the same stag's head seal her grandfather had used because she had inherited the seal with the house, and she put the paper in the cupboard with her grandfather's, which she had returned to the cupboard after the night, because she thought the next inheritor should have both. The clock ticked on its own, perhaps 3/4 of an hour after the pendulum had begun to move. Hester stood. She went down the stair. She closed the door at the foot of the stair behind her, as her grandfather's letter had said. She went into the small sitting room. She built up the fire. She sat in the chair her grandfather had sat in for 40 years. She did not sleep that night. In the morning, Mrs. Aiken came up at 7, found Hester in the chair in the sitting room, took one look at her, and went straight to the larder for the keys without asking. She went up to the landing alone. She came down after some time. She sat opposite Hester in the other chair. She did not speak. She did not ask. After a long while she said, "Mrs. Marlowe, I am sorry I went home last night. You could not have known, Mrs. Aiken." "No, but I am sorry. It was not your fault." "It was not anyone's fault, Mrs. Marlowe. That is the thing about the clerk. It is not anyone's fault. It is only that the clerk had been wound for 193 years, and it stopped under your hand, and the stopping was the shape your life took at 5 minutes past 9 on the 23rd of December, and there is no fault in it. There is only what you saw and what you carry now." "Yes. Will you tell me what you saw?" "No, Mrs. Aiken, I will not." "That is right. You are not to. Your grandfather told me, when I succeeded my mother, that the seeing is the keeper's and the keeper's alone, and that the housekeeper is not to ask. I will not ask again. I am only sorry that the asking is what came up in me, and I have apologized for it now, and will not apologize again." "Thank you, Mrs. Aiken." Hester wound the clerk for the 26 years that followed. She did not let it stop again. She did not, in any of those years, sleep in the chair at the head of the landing, even when she was ill. She had Mrs. Aiken move into the house in 1898, when Mrs. Aiken was 74, and her cottage had grown cold. Mrs. Aiken kept the small bedroom at the back of the kitchen until her own death in 1906. The housekeeper after Mrs. Aiken was a young woman from the village named Lily Aiken, who was Mrs. Aiken's grandniece, and who had been told by Mrs. Aiken in her last illness everything Mrs. Aiken had been permitted to tell. Lily kept the house with Hester for 14 years, and the clerk did not stop in any of them. Hester saw her daughter again 3 times after the stopping in Edinburgh in years when Mrs. Aiken, or Lily, was able to keep the house for the 4 days of the journey there and back. She did not, in those 4 days, sleep more than 2 hours a night, because she was, at every hour of her absence, aware of the clock at the head of a landing 3 days' journey south of her. She kissed her grandchildren. She came home. She did not regret going. She did not, also, suggest to her daughter that she come more often than the 3 times the duty allowed. Hester died at the age of 79, in the winter of 1920, in her own bed at Coldwell, 2 doors from the head of the stair where the clerk had stood for 218 years. Lily Aiken found her in the morning. The clerk had been wound the night before by Hester herself, who had climbed the stair at 9, as she had climbed it for 26 years, and who had wound the key the 8 full turns and hung it on the peg and gone to bed. The clerk was running when Lily came up, and the duty, by Hester's will, passed to her sister's grandson in Halifax, who came north within the month to take possession. The young man, his name was Charles, and he was 28, was met at the gate by Lily Aiken on a cold March afternoon. She brought him into the kitchen. She made him tea. She told him there was a paper in a cupboard upstairs that he was to read, and a key on the inner wall above the landing window that he was to take down at 9 that evening, and a long case clock at the head of the landing that had been wound by his great-aunt, and her grandfather, and her grandfather's grandfather, and 7 generations of Marlowes before them, and that the winding of it was his now, and that she would show him the doing of it tonight. She told him also that there was a second paper in the same cupboard, beside the first one, in his great-aunt's hand. She told him that this paper was to be opened only if the clerk stopped. She told him that no one living had read it. She told him she hoped he would not have to. She told him about his great-grandfather Joseph, and the night in May 1855. She told him about his great-aunt Hester, and the night in December 1894. She told him that the Marlowes who had let the clerk stop were the Marlowes who had been ill or grieving or both, and that the lesson of 218 years of keeping was that the chair on the landing was a chair to be passed without sitting. On any night, a Marlowe came up the stair to wind. She told him that this was the whole of what she had been told to tell. She poured him more tea. He drank it. He sat at the long, scrubbed table in the kitchen and looked out the window at the kitchen garden, and he was 28 years old, and the rest of his life had just been set out in front of him by a woman in a black dress at a table in a stone house at the foot of a Yorkshire dale, and he understood, sitting in the kitchen, that he had a choice. He could refuse the house. He could go back to Halifax and let it pass to whichever cousin came next on the list. He had been told by Mr. Halfyard the younger that morning that the choice was his. He did not, at the table, decide. He drank his tea. He looked at the garden. In the upper hall at the head of the stair, the clock ticked. May the houses on the high dales always be kept by men and women who can climb a stair at 9 and turn a key 8 times and come down. May the chairs on the landings of such houses always be passed without sitting. May the cupboards always remain closed, and the papers inside them, in the hand of one generation after another, always remain unread. Good night.